So, what happens when a president declares a national economic emergency, unleashes these massive tariffs, and then a federal court just steps in and says, not so fast? Well, today we're unpacking a really high stakes clash between the White House and the judiciary.
And let's just jump right in with the bombshell conclusion. On May 28th, 2025, a three-judge panel dropped this ruling. They said point blank that the president's tariff orders exceed any authority granted by IEEPA. And with that one sentence, they delivered a massive blow to the administration's entire trade strategy.
Okay, so that's the verdict, but the real story, the interesting part, is how we even got to this point. To really understand the impact of that decision, we've got to rewind a bit and see how this whole high-stakes economic battle got started. So here's the basic breakdown. A panel at the U.S. Court of International Trade didn't just, pause the president's tariffs, they ordered a permanent stop to them. This was a direct judicial block on what was a key pillar of the president's economic agenda. And how did Wall Street react? Oh, immediately and decisively. The moment the news broke, Dow futures shot up 500 points. See, this wasn't just some legal headline. For the markets, this was a huge signal, a potential end to a really volatile trade war, and maybe a return to some predictability. Which, of course, raises the big question. How did a trade dispute over imports suddenly escalate into a full-blown national emergency? To figure that out, we have to look at the justification the White House was using. To really get a grip on these tariffs, you first have to understand the extraordinary legal justification that was used to create them. I mean, this was not your typical trade negotiation passed through Congress. No, this was something different. The legal tool right at the heart of this whole conflict is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. The best way to think about it is like a presidential power-up that was created back in 1977. It lets the president regulate commerce without having to go through Congress. But, and this is a big but, there's one condition. They have to declare a national emergency to combat an unusual and extraordinary threat. So what was this so-called extraordinary threat? Well, according to the executive orders, it was the country's massive trade deficit. The administration's argument was basically that if we're consistently importing way more than we're exporting, it weakens our industries, makes the country vulnerable, and that, they argued, is a threat to national security. So that was the whole justification for using the emergency powers of IEEPA. So, with that national emergency declared, the stage was set for some serious action. And when that action came, wow, it triggered a really rapid back-and-forth escalation, especially with China. And when I say rapid, I mean incredibly fast. Just look at this one-week period in April. On the 2nd, the U.S. imposes its first tariffs. Just 2 days later, China hits back. And only 4 days after that, the U.S. responds by massively jacking up its own tariffs. This was basically a trade war in fast forward. And the scale of this was just staggering. The general tariff on Chinese goods, it more than doubled. The de minimis duty, that's a tax on all those small, low-value shipments that often fly under the radar. It tripled, from 30 to 90%. Even the fee on every single postal item was set to triple. We are not talking about minor tweaks here. These were massive economic shockwaves.
Okay, so with these huge tariff hikes in place, the stage was set for a legal challenge. And that, of course, brings us right back to the courtroom, where the opponents were arguing that the president had simply gone way too far.
The court's decision really came down to a strict reading of that IEEPA law. Basically, they had two big problems with it. First, they found that the law just doesn't give the president the power to impose these kinds of sweeping, universal tariffs. And second, on a separate order that was targeting drug trafficking, they ruled the administration didn't show how taxing all imports would actually stop the flow of illegal drugs. So in short, the court said the president's actions were a legal overreach. Well, the White House response was swift and it was forceful. Spokesperson Kush Desai framed this as a fundamental question of who has the power, arguing that it's the executive branch, not unelected judges, that gets to decide how to respond to a national emergency. And that right there sets up a classic constitutional showdown. But for the people who actually brought the lawsuit, and we're talking several states and businesses here, the argument wasn't just about some abstract legal principle. They were pointing to the real-world impact.
saying these tariffs were hurting the economy, inflating prices on everyday goods, and putting a really unfair burden on American families and businesses that rely on imports. So, a federal court has spoken, but believe me, this legal and economic battle is far from over. So, what does the immediate future actually hold for these tariffs?
Literally, the very same day the ruling came down, the administration filed an appeal. So the case is now headed up the judicial ladder to the U.S. Court of Appeals. And from there, who knows? It could potentially even reach the Supreme Court for a final decision. A trade expert named Jack Slagle really puts this ruling into perspective. He points out that this legal battle is about one specific tool, that IEEPA law. Even if the administration loses this appeal, the underlying trade disputes, they don't just disappear. The White House could just look for other legal ways to impose tariffs. His big takeaway? This is, quote, far from over. And that leaves us with the fundamental question at the absolute center of this entire story. It's a question about the limits of presidential power, about the role of the courts, and really about the very definition of a national emergency in our interconnected global economy. It's a debate that's going to continue long after this specific court case is decided.